like to say good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cleveland Public Library. My name is Councilman Brian Kazy, City of Cleveland. I represent Ward 16, and we're convening this panel discussion today to listen as experts speak about the economic impact of publicly financed sports facilities. Not only the impact here in Cleveland, but the impact that we've had throughout the whole country, as these guys are not just local guys, these guys are experts from across the country. Today we're joined by actually one of Cleveland's own, Ken Silliman, who has worked in local government for 33 years. And he has been honored to have worked under three previous mayors of the city of Cleveland. He's worked under Mayor Voinovich, White, and Frank Jackson. Ken retired in 2017, and in his retirement, he has pursued several writing projects. Three Brothers, which is a semi-autobiographical screenplay about Northeast Ohio sports, dedicated brothers who took dramatically different paths toward their goals, and a Cleveland Sports Facilities, a 35-year history. Ken was the chief of staff under Mayor Jackson for 11 years. He's also served as the executive assistant for development, assistant chief director of law, assistant director of law. He's got his JD from North Carolina, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he did his master's or his bachelor's at Case Western. Ken was also served on Gateway Economic Development Corporation from August 2018 till January of 2024, where he was also the previous chair of Gateway. So Ken's one of our guys that are here today. Ken is all the way to my right. First one is you're looking at to the left. I'm also here with Brad Humphreys, who is a native West Virginian and WVU alumni. Brad holds a BS in Business Administration and a BS in Economics from West Virginia University, Chambers College of Business and Economics, and an MA and PhD in Economics from the Johns Hopkins University. He is a professor of economics in the John Chambers College of Business and Economics. He previously held positions on the faculty at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the University of Alberta, and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is the 2016-17 Benedum Distinguished Scholar in Social and Behavioral Sciences at WVU. He is the recipient of the 2002 Peter Sloan Award for his research contributions to European sports economics. He has served as the president of the Eastern Economic Association in 2021 and 22. His research on the economics and financing of professional sports and the economics of gambling has been published in academia journals in economics and policy analysis, including the Journal of Urban Economics, the Journal of Law, Economics and Organization, the Journal of Policy and Analysis and Management, etc. He has published more than 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals. He is the co-editor of a 3-volume The Business of Sport, a comprehensive examination of sports business, economics, and finance, which was named as Outstanding Business Reference Source by the Business Reference Source Committee of the American Library Association. He is the editor-in-chief of Contemporary Economy Policy, a general interest economics journal, and serves as the editor's board for the Journal of Sports Economics, the Internal Journal of Sports Finance, the International Journal of Sports Management and Marketing, and the International Journal of Sports Marketing and Sponsorships, the Internal Journal. This guy does a lot. On top of that, he's also testified before Congress twice on the economic impact of professional sports of teams and facilities. He has also testified before the Massachusetts Legislature and Washington, D.C. City Council on the financing of sports facilities. And in 2014, he co-authored a report with economists from the Brattle Group for the Governor's Office of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, evaluating taxpayer liabilities associated with hosting the 2024 Olympic Games. The Boston 2024 Olympic bid was terminated shortly after his report was published. So we want to welcome Brad Humphreys here as well today. And then our third panelist, the guy in the middle of those three, is Victor Matheson, is a professor in the Department of Economics at the College of the Holy Cross, where he has taught since 2004. Victor is among the nation's leading experts on economics of sports. He He's the author of 5 books and over 100 journal articles of book chapters on various issues relating to sports economics, including studies of the economic impact of Summer and Winter Olympic Games, the World Cup, and the Super Bowl. He is frequently sought after by the media and has appeared on NPR's Marketplace, All Things Considered, and the Freakonomics podcast. Among the many magazines and newspapers in which he has been quoted are the Washington Post, The Economist, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and of course, the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Victor brings a unique perspective to the study of the economics of sports and has served for over 30 years as a professional and intercollegiate soccer referee, officiating for Major League Soccer, as well as many of the nation's top college conferences, including the ACC, Big East, and the Big Ten. So we are actually pretty honored to have these 3 individuals here with us today. So the way we're going to run the forum today is we're going to give them a couple of minutes just to kind of give their introductory speech for themselves. I have a couple of questions that I will ask, and then we really want the public to ask a good number of questions as well. So anybody, either from the media or residents or anybody who wishes to ask a question, you're going to be more than willing. If we run out of time today and you actually pen those questions that you would have outstanding and get them to me at some point, our panel has agreed to each answer any of those questions as well. So nobody will be left here without getting your questions answered at some time. So first we're going to start with Ken, who will give his little introductory. Then we're going to go to Brad, then we'll go to Victor. So Mr. Silliman.
Well, thank you, Councilman, and I want to express my appreciation for inviting me to this panel with these 2 distinguished national economic experts. And I also want to compliment you on your foresight in putting us right next to the Superman movie shoot. And perhaps when we're done today, we can all walk over and be part of the crowd scenes in the filming anyway. So you put together a very challenging agenda for today. Gateway deficits, the Brown Stadium, and a new soccer stadium. But I think if we start with how do we preserve our existing sports facilities and go from there, that makes sense. The capital repairs for the 3 pro sports facilities, that being the ballpark, the Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, and the Brown Stadium, they're all paid for by a county-wide tax on cigarettes, alcohol, wine, and that tax generates on average about $13 million a year. And the proceeds are divided equally among the 3 sports facilities. So that's how we pay for upkeep, and that has been in place since the voters approved the sin tax extension back in 2014, and it continues through the year 2034. Now that tax, which is commonly known as the sin tax, has never been adjusted for inflation. It was first enacted in 1990, and if you just look at how prices have moved since 1990, they've more than doubled. So the question I'm going to ask is, what if we ask the Ohio legislature to authorize us to go to the county voters and adjust for inflation by doubling the effective rate on the sin tax? Now that's not as radical as it sounds. When you say doubling a tax, it sounds pretty radical. But when you're talking about a glass of beer, one of my favorite bartenders, Kevin Graham, is in the audience, or a bottle of wine, the impact is really pennies on the dollar. It's only hard liquor where it would go from $3 to $6. So if you were to do that, you would double the annual amount available for each sports facility. That would take it from $9 million per facility to about, from $4.5 million per facility to about $9 million. That would go a long way towards addressing the gateway construction challenges that we've seen in the last year, year and a half. It would also go a long way to anticipating increased capital repairs at Brown Stadium. But we all know there's an elephant in the room with Brown Stadium, and that is the public debate over two options. First, whether the public pays half of a $1 billion lakefront stadium rebuild, or second, whether the public pays half of a $2.4 billion new Brook Park Dome. I submit there's a third option, which is simply to keep investing in the existing facility and look at it like we look at Fenway Park in Boston, Wrigley Field in Chicago, or Lambeau Field in Green Bay, and just keep investing in that facility. Now, where is the demand coming from the patrons of the stadium for the proposed $1 billion rebuild? I submit, and I was one of these season ticket holders until just recently, I submit if you ask the average ticket buyer at Cleveland Browns Stadium, they would say, just give us a team that's consistently competing for the playoffs. And they're not, I suspect, asking for this $1 billion rebuild. Season tickets annually sell out, and there's an 8,000 person waiting list for season tickets. What about the fans in the expensive seats, who are probably mostly from outside the county, and I suspect are really the driving force for the Haslam's requested $1 billion rebuild? I'm submitting that they, and not city taxpayers, ought to pay for the luxury upgrades of the stadium, either via higher ticket prices, which would allow the owners to recoup an upfront outlay, or via personal seat licenses. Those of you who followed the Buffalo Stadium issue have heard that personal seat licenses are being sold for $50,000 per seat. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do anything like that here, but if you just charge the 20,000 most expensive seats, $10,000 per seat, that would go a long way to funding the Browns' request. Now, having said that, some of you might ask, aren't we playing with fire here? We lost the Browns in the 90s. Could we risk doing that again by not fully accommodating the owner's request? Well, there are substantial differences between where we were in the 90s and where we are today. What's similar is that we're on the verge of an expiring lease, as we were in the 90s. 3 years remaining in the 90s, 4 years today. But everything else is vastly different. Back in the 90s, we were dealing with an aged and deteriorating Cleveland Municipal Stadium. That's not the case today. Despite what you may have read in the newspapers, it was not hastily built, it's not falling apart. It's in pretty good shape, as a city facility study confirmed last fall. It is not functionally obsolete as the stadium was in the 90s. It received a major overhaul back in 2014. It's pretty up to date. We do not have a cash poor owner today. We did back in the 90s. We do not have an obvious competing city with funding to build a brand new stadium for the owners. That was the case in the 90s in the form of Baltimore and a $200 million state allocation. Now, I can't speak to the Bibb administration's lakefront proposal and how the stadium fits into that, but I suspect it includes several $100 million in adjacent infrastructure, things like the land bridge to make it easier for pedestrians to get down the lakefront, parking underneath the land bridge, and potentially a connector between the land bridge and the stadium. it seems to me that those are pretty significant enhancements to the stadium's value that the owners should, I'm sure they appreciate. They're asking for more than that. Back in February, the Plain Dealer's Lucas DePriel asked this question of the readership of the Plain Dealer. What if the Haslams reduced their ask by $300 million? What could that buy in terms of city services? And his article went on to give some examples, primarily in the area of recreation. The city could build 8 new aquatic and community centers citywide for that $300 million. The city could build 20 new pools and 900 new playgrounds. So with that in mind, and giving due consideration to the Haslam's generous charitable history in Cleveland, they've given to cause after cause that you don't often read about in the newspapers. And they've also paid for new high school football fields across the city. So they have been good corporate citizens in Cleveland. I submit if they can now consider either rescinding or substantially trimming their stadium public ask, they can cement their charitable legacy. Lastly, what about the $90 million request for the new soccer stadium? First, let's consider that there are at least 5 cities that use their football stadiums as soccer stadiums as well, including 2 of the most successful soccer franchises in Seattle and Atlanta. That could, at minimum, buy us some time if we used our own stadium in that fashion. If we can do that, it's easier to raise the $90 million public ask if we have a few years to do so. I'll stop there. There's lots of economic stuff to get into, and these other 2 panelists are expert in that.
All right, thanks, Mr. Silliman. Mr. Humphreys?
Thanks very much for inviting me here to participate in this. I think it's great to make sure that taxpayers and decision makers are well informed about the research that bears on any sort of question that people face in terms of the economics. So I'll give you just a quick story about how I got into the business of doing research on the economic impact of professional sports in the local economy. As it turns out, I was living in Baltimore in the 1990s when
Traitor.
when Baltimore stole the Browns from Cleveland to become the Ravens. And as part and parcel of that, a new stadium was built for the Ravens in Baltimore, and it was 100% publicly financed by the taxpayers of Maryland. And so the immediate question that always comes up in cases like this is, well, what's the return on taxpayer dollars to subsidizing the construction of a new NFL stadium? And as always happens in these cases, there was an economic impact study commissioned that I read that claimed that an NFL team playing 8 to 10 games per season in a new stadium would generate 30,000 jobs and raise local income by hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And I looked at that, and I had not really done any research on this topic at that point. And I said, that's ridiculous. There's no way that 10 football games is generating that sort of an economic impact. And so I decided to write a paper, and it was published 25 years ago, the first paper I wrote on this, where teams have moved around the country ever since we've had professional sports leagues. New stadiums have been built, right? Old ones have been torn down. We can look at that as a sort of laboratory to see what happened in those cities after teams left or came in or new facilities were built. And the bottom line finding in that paper was nothing. There was no change in local economies, despite, Cleveland lost a hockey team, right? In the 70s. Didn't bother the economy, according to my results. So I've now been working 25 years on trying to address the question of what is the economic impact along all dimensions of professional sports in local economies. In terms of the tangible impacts, there's zero evidence in 30 years of peer-reviewed academic research that a professional sports team in a city generates any substantial new jobs, raises wages, raises income, raises property taxes. There's just no evidence of that. What professional sports are good at is moving economic activity around to different parts of the city. So, if a new NFL stadium is built out by the airport, it's going to move a lot of economic activity that would have taken place downtown, or somewhere else in Cleveland, and concentrate it there. And that's completely consistent with 30 years of research. So, if you want to build or if you want to renovate a professional sports facility because of civic pride or because of the sense of community it generates, that's fine. But just don't subsidize these sort of projects with the idea that there's going to be a tangible economic return that'll come back out of it, because there's just no evidence of that. And the final point I want to make is you did a really good job of highlighting something that I think often gets lost in these debates. That is that these government subsidy dollars have opportunity costs. And it's really difficult to value that. Economists know that, if you spend $500 million renovating an NFL stadium, that's $500 million that could have been spent on something else. And you gave perfect examples of what could have been done with that, and I think that's a really important part of the public debate on these sort of issues.
All right, thank you, Mr. Humphreys. Mr. Matheson?
Hi again, thanks for having us. And I would also like to say that it's really nice to be at a panel like this, because in stadium debates, the taxpayers and the public is always outspent, outgunned by huge amounts of money. And of course, the reason for that is because the gains for the new stadium are highly concentrated. And therefore, the Haslams can afford to spend millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars even in campaigning and in economic impact statements and hiring, hired guns to make their point. It's so rare to get taxpayers who lose, but they only lose a small amount of money, so it's very hard to organize them in important ways. I did receive an email from someone in anticipation, person I don't know, in anticipation of coming here. And basically, a quote in their email was, "The construction of stadiums in Cleveland is regularly called a success story. And if the goal was to build state-of-the-art structures and to refurbish a small district within the city, then the outcome was indeed successful." So that's exactly what Brad said, and of course that's exactly what Ken did as a person who worked on making a successful gateway project. If the goal is to enhance economic benefits for the city as a whole, much less evidence of that, and so that's what we definitely see. One of the things I just want to on my little piece here is, I know one of the big issues that probably a lot of people are interested in is the idea of domed versus non-domed stadiums. I just want to bring a little bit of data for us here. I also want to point out that there's lots of things that seem big that are actually small. So that's the other point here. Don't worry, this isn't a 47 slide piece here. But first of all, talking about dome stadiums. Dome stadiums, this is becoming an increasingly crowded marketplace. And there are not that many big events that dome stadiums are going to be useful for. So if we think about domed venues already in the United States, Atlanta, Nashville, Indianapolis, a bunch of these are new as well. Detroit, Minneapolis, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, New Orleans, Las Vegas, that's a new one, Glendale, St. Louis, Los Angeles is kind of semi-domed. You probably couldn't put basketball in there, but you can put other events. And then there's a bunch of new ones that are on the table, at least potentially. Chicago, Kansas City, DC, Charlotte, Tampa, all, that Tampa stadium's a baseball stadium, not a football. But when you think about Cleveland competing for events, you say, oh, if we only had a dome stadium, we'd get all these huge events. Remember, you're in competition with a huge number of other cities for a limited number of pieces here. I'd also like to say, well, look, is it the fact that that an indoor stadium would bring a lot more events to the city? This is data from 2002 through 2023. So it doesn't include Rolling Stones that were here on Saturday, I know, all right? But the total number of concerts held in Buffalo over those periods, outdoor stadium, right, similar to Cleveland, 9. Cleveland's only had 12 concerts over the last 22 years at that venue there. College football games, other sports, no men's basketball Final Fours, no Super Bowls, no college football national championships. look at kind of some comparable cities to Cleveland, Detroit, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, St. Paul, who have indoor stadiums. Yeah, there's a lot more events. Look at all those concerts they're having. Here's the thing, though. This is, look at Detroit there, 38 concerts. Man, that would be great for Cleveland if we had 38 concerts. That's 38 concerts over 22 years. It's a concert a year, right? So you say, well, look, there's so much more you can do with an indoor stadium. Well, yeah, one more concert a year, okay? Look at that Super Bowl. If Cleveland builds a dome stadium, it will get a Super Bowl. We have seen that. You will get one. You'll get one. You're not going to be in the rotation for the Super Bowls. You'll get one in exchange for a gigantic public handout. You might get a men's basketball Final Four. Indianapolis kind of has a little bit of hold on that because that's where the NCAA is from. You might see a college football championship, but again, you're in a big group of other cities that you're competing with. College football, Detroit has 44 college football games in Detroit. That's 2 college football games a season. Again, how much are you willing to pay in order to have one? And one's the Motor City Bowl. That's not a gigantic event, right? The other is the big HBCU kind of national championship. These are not gigantic events, right? And again, other sporting events, things like soccer and other things like that. Minneapolis, St. Paul's 58 college football games are all from the University of Minnesota, who doesn't use that stadium anymore. So again, these are big numbers, it looks like, but in reality, you're talking about a couple additional events a year. No matter what stadium you build, you are building a stadium that's going to sit empty 340 days a year, guaranteed. Another piece here is, well, how about do NFL stadiums attract tourists? I'm just going to give super, super brief flavor of how like Brad and I do work here. So we get a lot of data from hotel visitors. We have daily hotel data from 2012 to 2019, ended in 2019 to deal with COVID. And we take a look at hotels within a 10-mile radius of your venue. So we looked at Cleveland in particular. And sure enough, NFL regular season games do generate about 20,000 hotel room nights. You might say, well, that's great. That's a huge economic impact. That's fantastic. And of course, these non-NFL sporting events so you do a international soccer match, you do a bowl game, thing like that. That's like another 2,600 hotel room nights and concerts at the venue. So I mean, I haven't looked at what last Saturday looked like for hotels, but if the Rolling Stones were like a typical concert at these other 5 cities, that's another 1,800 hotel rooms. You're like, oh, wow, this should be spectacular. But let's talk about economic significance. When you talk about, I just screwed that up. I went too far. Let me go down here. Can you see? I know, I went one too far. I can't see my cursor.
There it is. Uh-oh.
Yep, no, that's fine. I'm just not going to screw it up this time.
This is why I don't do
I know.
slides.
Oh, and now my clicker's not working. Sorry. There we go. Okay, there we go. So NFL, 21,370 room nights. That's about $11 million in additional tourism revenue. I'm like, oh, this is great. That's about $2 million in tax revenue. Great. That's enough to fund $30 million of stadium. Okay? So the tourist benefits you get from Cleveland, from the Browns, the tourist benefits, not the other tax benefits, but this extra stuff, like bringing tourists into town. That's what we want, right? That's about $2 million in tax revenue you get from these additional tourists. $30 million in stadium costs. So if you want to say, hey, you know what, we should subsidize the Browns stadium to keep them in Cleveland, I'm not going to oppose that. And I'm all for the city giving them $30 million. But how much have the Browns asked for? Or at least
Depends on which project, doesn't it?
depends on which project, but we're talking about numbers in the not 30 million, but more like 300 million, more like 600 million. So we can make an argument for some level of subsidy because of these extra money that comes in, but it's a fraction of the sort of money that we actually generate. So that's where I will end my comments.
All right, thanks, Mr. Humphreys. At this time, I'm going to open up with a couple of questions, and then we're going to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions So I want to start with the first one. There was a recent article in The Atlantic by Dan Moore in which Mr. Matheson is quoted. If Mr. Moore is correct when he says in the article, and I'll quote him, economically speaking, stadium subsidies mostly just transfer wealth from taxpayers to the owners of sports franchises, end of quote. I'd like to know what, if any, are the benefits of giving precious taxpayer money to billionaire owners? Somebody's got to have something to say. I'll open it up to all three of you.
Okay, so when Brad said earlier that we have very little evidence of economic impact associated with this, the one place where we know there's a gigantic economic impact associated with building a new stadium is franchise valuation. You build a new stadium and that franchise owner becomes wildly more wealthy. The more money you give to as part of that project, obviously the less money out of that owner's pocket for that additional money. So we know that these make owners better off. In the case of the Haslams, this is a ownership group who bought a team in 2012 for $1 billion, now valued at about $4.5 billion, right? So this is a $3.5 billion of capital gains that they have earned on top of the profits of the actual team, but about $3.5 billion of capital gains they've earned over the last 12 years of owning the team. Guess what? $3.5 billion easily pays for any stadium project, either in Brook Park or at the lake, or other places. You could build something south of Progressive Field as well. Again, most business owners, when they say, oh, my business is doing so well, I want to expand, they don't ask the taxpayers to come and pay for that. That being said, it's not like there's no value associated with professional sports. There are some amenity values, there are civic pride values. I still think back to Cleveland-related anecdote here. I mean, I know it's from a movie, but right, from Major League, the movie, when the Indians Indians at the time, right, win the World Series in that, or clinch the ability to get into the World Series. You have the guy with the big mohawk hugging with the guy in the construction helmet. I mean, these sort of social benefits are real, they're tangible. Guess what? We can measure them. And when we measure them, we get 10, 20, 30, $40 million of amenity value associated with sports franchises, right? Another reason we could subsidize sports franchises, and again, we got 30 million here and another 40 million of amenity value. If you want to tell me $75 million subsidy from the city or the county to the sports teams, I'm not going to argue in favor of that, but I'm not going to squawk too loudly about that either. But again, amount of amenity versus what is being asked for are out of line by maybe even a factor of 10.
I've got an answer too to that, which is you give those tax dollars to owners so they don't move the team. And I think anybody who lives here in Cleveland, or I lived in Baltimore 17 years, lost a NFL team there. That's one of the reasons why local governments or state governments wind up providing these subsidies to keep that team from moving. Why is that possible, and why does that happen? This is the bigger point I want to make. It's because, as a matter of public policy in the United States, we treat professional sports leagues differently under antitrust law than any other industry. And that, what it means is the NFL controls how many NFL teams there are. And there's always some city, that means, that would love to have an NFL team but can't get one because that's under the control of the NFL. If some billionaire wanted to open up a theme park in a city that didn't have a theme park, there would be no problem whatsoever. He or she could put their money down and build that thing. But imagine if the way we treat things here in the United States is, well, what if all the other theme park owners in the country had control over who built a theme park somewhere? That's what happens with sports leagues. So, there was no NFL team in Baltimore for a long time. Why? Well, because the NFL didn't want to put a team there. They wanted team owners to have a place to threaten to move to. There was no NFL team in Los Angeles, the second largest media market in the country, for nearly 20 years. And over that 20-year period, 17 NFL team owners threatened to move their team to Los Angeles. Why was there no team in LA though? Because that's the way the league wanted it, and our antitrust law allows them to do that. So that's my answer.
Why do cities give millions, or now in the last year, billions to sports teams owners? As someone who dealt with those issues for 30 years at City Hall, I would submit that it's a very rare politician that does so out of generosity to the billionaires. In virtually every situation, the elected officials are responding, as Dr. Matheson indicated, to a threat that the team will move out of town. And over the last 30 years, the sports leagues and their owners have perfected the art of playing city against city, state against state, and leveraging the threat to move as the price of you have to pay to keep your team in town. And I assure you, the mayors I work for, we're not wanting to leave dollars on the table. Whatever we did in the past, and I notice a lot of the progressive caucus leadership is here, and I submit my name has been like the Antichrist over the last, yeah. And the point is, we were responding to what we thought it would take to keep the team in town. Now, why am I singing a little different tune today? Because there is not the threat of losing the team that there was in the past. I distinguish 1990s from today as far as the football situation and that. And therefore, I think the civic leaders today have a lot more leeway to cut a different kind of bargain than we did in the many years that are detailed in my book on Cleveland sports facilities.
All right, thank you. I'll ask one more, and then we'll open it up to the public. When a team gets a new stadium, you immediately see its valuation rise, right? It becomes worth a heck of a lot more. What would be the benefit of cities issuing a tax levy on the increased value of the franchise, so that the cities could actually see some of the upside of the public investment?
So that's fine, but again, if the whole reason for the subsidy is in the first place is, as Ken is saying, to prevent that team from leaving, a subsidy that you give and then take back right away, the owners are smart enough to understand that that is no longer a subsidy, because any value that they will get from the better stadium will be clawed back by the folks later. So again, if the subsidy's whole idea is not just to enrich billionaires, that's the secondary effect of the subsidies. And Ken's of course 100% right on that. Is the first intent isn't to make billionaires richer, it's to keep the stadium or keep the team. But you're not going to keep the team if that's the way you set it up in the first place.
I think that any professional sports league would push back extremely hard against any attempt to do something like that, because that would be anathema to the way that they operate. And I can't imagine the sort of PR campaign that would be unleashed against the local politician or policymaker who would propose taxing the value of a sports franchise.
All right, at this time, anybody in the audience have any questions? Hang on, well, ladies go first. Here we go.
Thank you. Karen Nelson, somewhat recent transplant here from Washington, D.C., where I was in commercial development, commercial real estate agent, but in product development for about 25 years. Turns out Brad and I worked on different sides of the same project. For Ken, this mayor now fully understands, I think, the value of waterfront development. And there was just a study done in DC by the Washington DC Economic Partnership showing that commercial and residential rents and sales figures were a magnitude higher than any place else in the city for the waterfront development that DC has undertaken over the last 25 years. What is your definition of highest and best use for the land that the current stadium sits on?
I would agree with your point that the current use is not the highest and best economic use, that if you built a football stadium somewhere else, that the economic return from that parcel of land would be substantially higher. I think, though, that the public officials charged with, managing the lakefront are probably going to ask a broader question, and it won't necessarily be what generates the highest economic return, but what generates the highest benefit for the public at large. And the question would be whether, some kind of recreational or other use might benefit the public at large. Now, that's a tricky question, and if you've read Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of American Cities, the suggestion that just because you put a park in a particular location, people are going to flock to it, that doesn't always happen. A lot depends for a park to really work on what's immediately around it and those sorts of things. So Mayor Bibb has a lot of challenging questions to ask. From what I can see from the outside looking in, he and his administration have done a very good job of analyzing the lakefront and its potential. And I would just, again, conclude that I think they can consider economic use, but only as one factor and not as the controlling factor.
May I ask a follow-up? A stadium is a depreciating asset,
Yes.
and to keep pouring money into a bunch of concrete and rebar. All right, a stadium is a depreciating asset, and to continue to pour money into a depreciating asset, since they require a lot of renovation and redo to be competitive with the other cities that you mentioned, it seems to me to not be a good use of anybody's funds when to continue the waterfront plans that are currently being developed now onto the over 20-some acres of the stadium land. Seems to me that you've got a once-in-a-generation chance here to get this right for future generations, because whatever you build for residential, office, hotel, parks, libraries, are going to be there for a lot longer than that depreciating asset stadium.
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you, because when you say depreciating asset, somebody online had a very interesting comment. Isn't it coincidental that 25-year-old NFL stadiums require demolition or major overhauls, while 100-year-old college stadiums in Columbus and Ann Arbor persevere through the ages? I submit that if we look at our sports facilities the way people look at Fenway Park in Boston, Wrigley Field in Chicago, Lambeau Field in Green Bay,
Ken, can you use the mic?
we don't need to
Ken,
look at them
Can
as
you make sure you use the mic?
oh,
Yeah.
we don't need to assume that they're depreciating assets. And my point is, well, I would agree that if you didn't have the stadium there, you could make a lot of good creative uses of their property. If you move the stadium somewhere else and there's a much larger public subsidy demand, and going back to the opportunity costs of that public subsidy, what I would say is it may not be the ideal location to have a stadium, but we have a lot of sunk costs invested in that, and avoiding the huge expense of a stadium somewhere else is worth avoiding.
I would just add that there's no obvious reason that a stadium is a faster depreciating asset than any other type of commercial building. I mean, for example, we did use a 2,700-year-old stadium in the 2004 Summer Olympics in Greece, so. Say your name.
My name is Chuck Hogan. I'm with the Plain Press. And I think actually the stadium, if you look at the county, it's worth more than it was when it was built for tax purposes. But I want to ask Ken Silliman if he remembers, there's not a lot of discussion about the repair money that the city has provided through the 1995 increase in the admissions tax, the motor vehicle license tax, and the parking tax. And I think about $15 million a year goes into the stadium. But what I want to ask about is this legislation first said that that money from those increases was supposed to go to Cleveland schools for extracurricular activities. And initially, $2 million went, and there was a big debate at the time, and White said he wasn't going to put the schools second to the stadium. And I'm wondering if the thinking behind that was that that would make up for the exemption that had gone to stadiums when Gateway was passed, and the stadium wouldn't be paying property tax, so whatever it should have been paying, they were going to make up for it. Or was that just a number that White pulled out of the air, $2 million? And subsequently, I think in 2011, Frank Jackson lowered the amount to $1 million, and it's been hovering around $1 million for those extracurricular programs. So I'm wondering what the original basis was for that $2 million.
Great question, and fortunately, I was around in both administrations. The various tax breaks that the Gateway Project got back in the 90s, they were part of balancing the construction budget. And in a perfect world, you wouldn't have had to give those tax breaks, but they were part of making the project work economically. That being said, when we were debating the Brown Stadium funding in 1995 and 1996, Mayor White, those of you who were around back then, he led an initiative back 91, 92 for the mayor to reclaim governorship of the schools. The schools were always a critical issue for Mayor White, and therefore, as part of putting together the Brown Stadium proposal in 95 and 96, he just felt it was the right thing to do to include the $2 million as part of the overall plan. Now, you referenced back in 2011 where that was reduced, and again, Mayor Jackson didn't do that because he didn't like the schools. We were facing, we were still recovering from a national recession. Also, we were dealing with the state of Ohio that was basically defunding cities in a huge way back around 2010, 2011. And we had major budget challenges at the time. Mayor Jackson did then, shortly after that, lead the community through the Cleveland Plan for Education. So education was equally important for both mayors. You make some good points, but hopefully I've given some additional background for those decisions.
What I'm wondering is the initial decision, was that based on what the stadium, if it were paying property tax, would have paid?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, so it's just a number he pulled out of the air.
It's a number he felt was right.
Happens all the time.
And I think that the other concern is that when it was dropped, I mean, it's been a lot of years since it's dropped, and it's still down around that 1 million level. I think it was 1.125 last year, and it's back under 1 million this year. I mean, why now? Why hasn't it been restored to at least the original amount?
Well, I haven't been in city government since 2017, so you probably need to direct that question to somebody who's still involved. Thank you.
So my name is Chris Arsh, I'm a member of City Council.
Yes.
Ward 13 School Brooklyn. First off, thank you
Kazy for putting this together. This is a panel and a room full of people that I've been wanting to see have a conversation about this very subject for a long time, so I'm glad we're here. Mr. Silliman, I did read your book. Thank you for writing it. There's a lot of really good information in there, and I think anybody who wants to talk seriously about stadiums in Cleveland needs to read that, just to have a primer on what's brought us to this point so far. I'm going to steal your language. I would submit to this room that there is also a very crucial piece of information, which is that stadium deals are negotiated between the administration and the owner, and then they're brought to legislatures for approval or rejection. So as it stands right now, the legislature in Cleveland is not part of the negotiation. It's an odd spot for us to be in because something's going to come our way, but we're not part of that conversation. I have two questions. Along the same lines of taxing the value of the team itself, is there anything that legally prevents a city from entering a revenue sharing agreement with a team owner? For instance, the Haslams have other minority partners in the team. If the city were to try to create a revenue sharing agreement with the Haslams to recoup investment, is there any legal reason that you know of that would be impossible?
Yeah, the NFL bylaws explicitly prohibit those sort of arrangements. So
is Green Bay the grandfather?
it's grandfathered in. It's grandfathered in. And it's also not quite the stock ownership that many people think it is. But I don't want to get in the weeds about who owns the Packers. But they are explicitly grandfathered in, and the league bylaws say you can't do that.
Okay. Even if the Haslams wanted to make a minority partner shell, that ostensibly was the city, they can't do that.
No.
Okay. The second question I have is that the conversation around a $2.4 billion dome in Brook Park seems somewhat laughable to those of us who work in municipal finance. The city of Brook Park has a total of 35 police officers in their entire city. The idea that they could raise 1.2 billion is just an absolute joke. And I guess my thought process is this conversation, do you suspect that perhaps this conversation is just a ruse to get us to think more about Cleveland's public investment? Because it seems like $100 million over the next 20 years is very different from a $1 billion investment for the next 30 years. Why do you suppose we're having this conversation about Brook Park when it's pretty much a non-viable concept?
So I think you're exactly right. One of the key ways that you extract subsidy from cities is to create a credible threat for the franchise to move. Exactly what Brad said. Sometimes those credible threats are external, right? So it's Los Angeles, it's London, it's San Antonio, something like this. And the teams will try very, very hard to make those movement threats credible. But what a city lawyer's job, a city manager's job, a mayor's job is to actually play the poker game, right? Don't assume that the person is in fact holding a straight flush, right? These are not credible movements all the time. But certainly it's every bit in the league and the owner's interest to create credible threats. And when they can't create a credible external threat, create a credible internal one. It's like, oh, no, we're not, don't worry, I'm not going to move the team to London, but boy, Brook Park looks pretty good, right? And so where you don't have a credible external threat, you create the threat inside the metro area. But again, it's up to the press, it's up to city management, it's up to voters when they get the chance to decide whether that's really a credible threat or not. And I think most of the time, especially now that Los Angeles has closed as a potential destination, there are not many credible threats. And when they give you something like, I know 5 cities right now that would be wildly happy to take the Browns right now and pay for a stadium. The correct answer is name them and tell me exactly how big that stadium subsidy is, because that is the last you'll hear of that sort of comment. Because those threats don't actually exist most of the time. But they want the voters, they want the mayors, they want city council persons to think that it's moving, and you're like, oh man, I'm never going to get reelected if I lose the Browns, right? And so, well, I guess we got to pay what they tell me.
Yeah,
It's like going into the car dealership, right? And say, man, I really, 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 really want a brand new Toyota Highlander, but I want a good deal, right?
And just to piggyback on Councilman Harsh, to our members of the media and CCPC and PLE for Cleveland, he's absolutely right. So Cleveland City Council right now is the legislative body, so we are not negotiating with the ownership of the Cleveland Browns right now. We're gonna get the brunt of it when that deal comes before City Council, is when your opportunity to hamper and give your opinion on Cleveland City Council. But remember, so much more work went in from the administration side of the deal to even get to City Council. So know that your time to start harping on Cleveland City Council won't be until after we take the vote or at the time of the vote, not for what comes to Cleveland City Council. But I want to ask Mr. Humphreys one question before we have a couple more. If we weren't talking about public subsidies, right? If we had an ownership that said, we're paying for everything ourselves, would we be having this conversation? And would the Cleveland Browns then be an economic engine for the city of Cleveland if there was no public dollars involved?
No, I would have no problem with it. But I think, that's why I had no problem with SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, because Stan Kroenke paid for the whole thing himself. And that tells us, and, what he's doing there is a multi-use real estate development around that stadium. I would have no problem with that whatsoever. Now, the economic impact of a team on the local economy, the urban economy, is really independent of how the financing works of a new stadium. The underlying economics in terms of consumer spending and concentrating consumer spending works the same no matter what the financing vehicle is for that. But, I don't have a problem with new stadiums, and I don't have a problem with professional sports. I just have a problem with public subsidies for billionaire team owners, and I would be perfectly, I wouldn't not have a negative comment about it at all if the Browns owners were willing to pay for the cost of their shiny new $2 billion stadium.
All right, thank you.
This is, excuse me, Jerry Gomez, Eastside Group. It was very interesting. You guys had a lot of some of these positions. I do have a couple of comments, though. You might imagine that. The two successful new stadium programs that are put up as economically successful are Jerry's World, which is basically Arlington outside of Dallas, and the Battery Project outside of Atlanta, where it isn't the stadium that's the economic engine. It's the development of the surrounding land. And that's exactly what the Haslams are saying about their Brook Park project. They're gonna build a stadium, but they want 100 acres around the land to develop on a real estate play. So the question for Cleveland is, how can they, let me back up for a second. Everyone I think in this room will agree and cheer that Cleveland needs to take advantage of its lakefront, right? The problem with the lakefront in Cleveland is getting over the freeway and the railroad tracks. In other words, these land bridges, okay? If you do that, then you open up all that lakefront for development. And guess what? If you could use the Haslam Stadium to get the land bridges built, and there is strong signals that there's federal money and state money to help build those maybe not the stadiums, but to build the land bridges, then all of a sudden you open up the lakefront for development, and guess what? The city of Cleveland owns 450 acres of land on the lake. It's called Burke Airport. And if they gave some of that land, let's say 100 acres to the Haslams to develop and be taxable, and they still have 350 acres to develop for themselves, you could literally make this something close to a fair deal with the Haslams and have a huge, huge impact, positive impact on Cleveland. Let me ask you two questions. What's the difference between a new Haslam Stadium downtown and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? What's the difference? What's the difference between having Taylor Swift performing in Brook Park and Taylor Swift performing in downtown Cleveland? So these analyses of the economic impact, incidentally, back up here a second.
You gotta come up with your questions. Let's get to the questions. You gotta ask one question, you got another question, you got another question, what's your second question?
Well, first, the claim that the battery in Cobb County, Georgia is successful is not supported by any evidence. There have been a number of peer-reviewed papers that have looked at very carefully, using very modern methods and the right data, and have found that there's no tangible economic impact in the battery that wouldn't have just been the same as the metro-wide growth in Atlanta. So I don't know about AT&T Field, but I know a lot of research that finds that the battery is not what people claim. So
The one thing I'll say about AT&T that's significantly different than what is going on here is, number one, voters voted on that, all right? And the voters, it was a close loss, but the voters said, yes, this is what we want to spend our money on. That's a whole lot different than a deal that is not put before voters. So that's number one. Also, the total amount of subsidy in Jerry World out of a $1.1 billion project was about $300 million. So you're talking about a 30%-ish of that price. We're talking a much higher percentage of the price for things here in Cleveland. So there's at least two differences between what's being proposed, at least in the early stages here, versus what happened in Dallas and Arlington.
And I'll address that real quick. One thing you may not know, between the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Science Center, and Cleveland Brown Stadium, over 1 million people a year visit the lakefront. That's 1 million people a year getting to the lakefront the way it currently is now. It's not like you're gonna build some $300 million land bridge and another 2 million people are gonna come. Not gonna happen. People have access now, the way it is. And then if you ask about a Taylor Swift concert between Cleveland and Brook Park, I'll give you just one reason off the top is the 8% admissions tax that the city of Cleveland gets per ticket that we wouldn't get if you brought something like that. But that was just to address those real quick. There you go. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm a resident of Cuyahoga County, not of the city of Cleveland, but I've been following the taxpayer conversation here locally for the past 10 years. My question is a two-part question. One is to the economists. I'm very interested in knowing if there are other examples of where citizens come from, where the attendees come from. Like in Cleveland, for example, 70% of individuals who come to these stadiums come from outside of Cuyahoga County. And so that has fueled the conversation around a facility fee or individuals who come to the stadiums pay ultimately for the maintenance. So I'm curious if you see similar type of attendance ratios in other cities and other stadiums across the country. And my question to Ken is, when we look at the conversation now versus even a few years ago, I know that there have been articles around these shortfalls in maintenance that the stadiums have been facing for many years now. But when I look at some of the most recent conversations, things like doubling the sin tax, for example, to try and stave off exposure to the general funds of the city and the county. But yet, when the Progressive Field Stadium lease was executed, a portion of the funding comes directly from the county's general fund. So it's already exposed in a way. So I'm wondering, how do you juxtapose the conversation of let's extend the sin tax or expand the sin tax in order to limit exposure to the general fund, when the general fund is already being utilized in leases already in present day?
Let's have you go first, Ken. No, let's have you go first, Ken, I think.
Okay, well, I'll take the second part because the
Yeah.
first part of your question was definitely for these gentlemen. But as far as you know, Will, the situation at Gateway, over the last 2 years, public construction costs have increased at a greater level than 25 years previous. And that really hit Gateway very hard, particularly with expensive projects such as seat replacements. So that is really forming the challenge that Gateway faces today, with that situation coupled with the Cavs $25 million self-financed, for now, investment, where they're looking for the public to come up with that sum of money. My proposal was simply to address that, as well as escalating over time needs at Cleveland Browns Stadium, double the sin tax. Now, you correctly point out that each stadium facility has some element of general fund already in it, and you're right, and it's very hard to avoid any general fund exposure. What you really have to do when you're looking at these various tax things is look at them in terms of fairness and who bears the burden. And arguably the sin tax, it's something that people can avoid if they don't, drink or smoke or whatever, is a fairer way of raising money than a property tax or a sales tax that everybody has to pay and has no choice in it. Nothing's perfect, but the sin tax, the main argument against the sin tax is it harms lower income families more than middle and upper income, so that is an issue. But you're right, there's elements of the general fund in each stadium, but you try to match up the taxes that people can opt out of if they so choose to go towards the stadiums. And now, part one of your question.
So I guess from a public finance standpoint is most economists advocate any time you can have the user of the venue pay for the venue, that's the way things should work. And think about it, a typical restaurant actually works like that, right? Who pays for it? It's the people who actually eat there who are paying for it. And if the restaurant needs some a new set of paint or needs some upgrades, and well, how does that happen? Well, all that accumulated money that the restaurant owner has goes to paying for those repairs and rehabilitation. So, and it doesn't matter whether that restaurant is a neighborhood restaurant that only local people go to, or people fly in from all across the country. User pays.
And in terms of 70% of the people who attend Browns games don't live in the county, right? Well, I mean, sure, is it good for Cuyahoga County to have those people come in and spend money and earn tax revenues off of it? Yeah, but from a broader perspective, that's money that's not spent. I'm assuming these people are mostly from other nearby counties. I don't think that there's 70% of the average Browns game is attended by people flying in to go and see the game, right? That's spending that would have taken place in other counties. So yeah, Cuyahoga County's better off, but there's counties where these people live that are worse off. There's businesses there that are worse off because people were spending money at the Brown Stadium. They're not going out to eat in their local restaurant. So it's moving spending around is what we know professional sports can do and is really good at.
And I think Ken hit the nail on the head when it comes to the sin tax, right? The majority of the sin tax payers are lower income individuals, primarily people of color as well. So you're asking the poorest of the poor to help subsidize the richest of the rich. So when you have a local politician who comes out against a tax increase, don't beat them up too bad, because it's about who's actually paying, and those individuals who are actually subsidizing it probably aren't going and utilizing the facilities themselves. So, when you ask for a double in the sin tax, you're asking the poorest of the poor to help subsidize the richest of the rich. If there's going to be something like that, it just needs to be spread out a little broader than just a sin tax.
Sam Allard, local media here. Have you guys seen, the national researchers, have you seen evidence nationwide of a successful grassroots resistance to a stadium project or renovation? And also, Ken has testified before that short of federal intervention, policy intervention, this situation of hostage economics is likely to persist. But given what I regard as maybe an increased sophistication of the electorate and an economic climate in which there's fewer potential destinations for these teams, is the moment now right for grassroots resistance to some of these projects?
So I'd say yes and no. First of all, when things are put before voters, voters do not like giving money to billionaire owners and millionaire players coming from regular folks. We just saw that in Kansas City. Literally, Kansas City, they've won the last 2 Super Bowls. They love the Chiefs. This is not, I mean, there's some teams where you're like, just get rid of them because I've had our fill. I'm not going to say anything about whether any Cleveland teams are in that group. Look, and they turned them down. They said, no, we do not want to give you our money. We saw a soccer stadium in Albuquerque get turned down. We saw renovations to a large rodeo facility of all things in Denver, Colorado. So we see these things getting turned down by voters quite often. There's a reason that the 2024 Olympics are starting next month in Paris and not in Boston. Again, grassroots fight against that. So the answer is yes. What's coming against it is the fact that we have a ton of stadiums. Cleveland's not the only one whose leases are expiring over the next decade, and so we're going to see this war again and again and again in city after city after city. As soon as that lease expires, that hands a gigantic amount of bargaining power to the teams and away from the taxpayers. Okay. Brad, speechless, doesn't happen often.
Hi guys, I'm Ross. I think in Cleveland here, as these guys know, there's far more non-voters than voters, but most everybody still pays taxes. Isn't, as far as you guys have studied this for decades, kind of the biggest problem, the framing in the major media kind of outlet papers about just the framing of it, right? Like, if you took 100 economists, get them out of America, take them from Canada, take them from our, and all 100 looked at the finances and the opportunity costs, they pretty much all say, this is the worst thing you can do for these non-voting taxpayers, you know, and generally these don't go to votes. That's nice about what happened in Kansas City. That's not going to happen here, you know, and so, and I was glad to see Chuck here, you know, Sam's here, how do we attack the main paper's narrative and who's behind it, and if the owners kind of sink their teeth into the sports writers, the sports radio talkers. I mean, the topic is just framed so horribly, in my humble opinion, but is there any way around who controls the narrative?
So you're exactly right. I mean, this is a great point. There's actually research on this, and there a couple of sociologists wrote a book that looked at in detail the way that sort of mainstream local media framed the issue of these subsidies. And they found that it was definitely slanted in favor of the team owners and the people that want those subsidies. Local Chamber of Commerce, they are almost always greatly in favor of these subsidies. In a recent paper that I wrote, we call these local growth coalitions. They're businessmen, they're people that not are the taxpayers, but who might have, you know, property developers who are gonna make some money off of the ancillary development that goes up around a new stadium or arena. They're uniformly in favor of these subsidies. And, you know, the local newspaper or television channel, they make revenues, ad revenues off coverage, and they don't want their ad revenues to drop, and that's why you see favorable op-eds and propaganda statements from subsidy proponents treated as fact in the local press. Or you see something like there's a guy who wrote a paper. I lived in Edmonton, Alberta for 6 years when there was a debate about that new arena for the Oilers going on, and he pointed out in this paper, he's a sociologist, that I in particular was marginalized in my opinions at the expense, and the team owner and the team were given very favorable coverage. For example, I was called an impediment to civic progress by the president of the Edmonton Oilers in the newspaper. So yeah, I don't know how you change that framing though, because there are, that's what we argue in this recent paper. There are powerful specific interests who want these subsidies, and they're going to benefit a lot more from them than the average taxpayer, who's maybe just going to pay, $15, $20 more per year in taxes. And that's just the unequal power relationship that's there. But I think it's really important, like you say, to recognize that.
Yeah, and the legacy media, they're not the muckrakers, right, in these cases, because, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, they have a whole sports section, right? And therefore, they don't want to hurt access for access journalism. They certainly don't want to lose a team, because there goes a bunch of their readers of the sports section. Of course, every local TV station, same thing. You've got 4 minutes of news, and then you've got 15 minutes of sports, right? And so you can understand how the thumb is on the scale there. Ken, you were going to say.
One thing that I would suggest to the local media is to start reminding the opponents of what's happening with these escalating, the football stadium in Buffalo is costing the public $1 billion. The new football stadium in Nashville is costing the public $1.26 billion. What the media does to some degree, not the mainstream media, but the more progressive media, is they attack the local officials that approve these subsidies. And certainly there's some merit to that, but one of my major points that I harp on redirect your attention to the federal legislators that allow the sports leagues to play city against city, and that won't stop until Congress acts. So rather than blaming the local officials that approve the subsidies, many cases out of legitimate fear they're going to lose the team, focus on Congress and deal with this monopolistic behavior out of the leagues that force cities to come up with these large subsidies to save their teams.
That's exactly right.
Hey, member of the local media here, thank you for the advice, I appreciate that. Has there ever been a successful campaign nationally to force surrounding counties to contribute to subsidies in some way? Anywhere has it ever happened?
So there have been individual compacts between states. So for example, Kansas City, Kansas and Kansas City, Missouri declared the 2019 border truce because they were fighting about every business. And a business gets 20 years of tax subsidy, and then they move across the border for another 20. And they declared a truce, which as of yesterday, they said, but that doesn't count for sports. So Virginia, DC, and Maryland also had a similar truce, but that didn't count. That falls apart occasionally. So that's the problem with all truces. We have seen this happen often. These truces occur, but then you can always fall apart when that next administration comes in, right? Because it's very hard to enforce them. I will also say that the national government also, in the 1980s, tried very hard to make sure that you couldn't use tax-exempt bonds to build stadiums. And unfortunately, what that did is, because obviously someone's always clever in trying to come up with a loophole, the idea was you can't use tax-exempt bonds for stadiums. And what that meant is that tax-exempt bonds paid for by revenues generated at the stadium can't be used. And what that meant is now we're taxing entities more broadly, and so everyone gets taxed instead of the user. Because that's how you got around the municipal bond exemption. So, people have tried, but, it's always, tit for tat, trying to figure out what that next step is going to be. But yes, there have been attempts to do this.
Truce is the official, that's what it's called. Legally speaking, this is called a truce.
They literally, I think it's called the border, the actual name they called in Kansas City was the 2019 Border War Truce, or Border Truce, or, but,
I'm not opposed.
but then again, literally in the last week, they said, oh, but that doesn't count for sports.
And to
Only
follow up
business.
with Ken, with Congress, about franchises moving or something, people laughed at me when I held a press conference, but remember, the Art Modell law in the state of Ohio, even though it's Cleveland and Brook Park, it's still city to city, right? We're still going through the same thing now. It's just instead of Baltimore, it's Brook Park, right? And it is more local, but that law was put into place to prevent cities from moving or doing this exact same thing, holding us hostage in an attempt to move.
Hi, my name is Kim Palmer. I'm also a member of the media, and I have actually been to Berea and seen the presentation of both the lakefront and the Brook Park along the suggested capital stack. And I know you talked about the idea that this is sort of a hostage thing. I'm going to push back on that a little bit, that the capital stack suggestion would also not involve Cleveland at all. It would involve the county, it would involve the state. I don't know how much detail I can go in, but I guess the question is, arguing that it is a very real chance that the stadium will move to Brook Park, and that Cleveland then would be left, with a big stadium on the lakefront. What impact, and I know you say this moves money around, but what impact would you see, happening with, now we're not diverting at least, some of the funds, to the stadium for maintenance and nothing out of the general fund, but yet we'd be left with, a big, arguably obsolete building on a lakefront that we are trying to develop.
I'll just give a very short, succinct statement. If the Haslam's want to go to Brook Park and develop a battery park development around that and all the benefits those involved, my point is, if that's your choice, fine, but there should be not one penny of public subsidy for that, because they're abandoning a perfectly functional, well-maintained lakefront stadium, which, as you point out, has a demolition cost before you can use that property for anything else.
And just as you can't say much, there's other people looking into the original lease and all the legislation. And remember, that team, by the NFL, was left to the city of Cleveland. The colors were left to the city of Cleveland. The name, the history was left to the city of Cleveland. It wasn't left to an ownership of whoever that is. They were left in the city, again, right.
But if the city, and I think some of your statements and city council statements that you aren't interested in the $1 billion, does that not, and to fix it, and there's a lot of pushback, could there not be an agreement for them to go 20 minutes outside of the city?
If you're asking, and I think I can speak with members of city council, nothing's been asked of us yet. So you may know more sitting out in Berea to be briefed, but they're not briefing us.
Well, I would say then, would you as a city council member, as an elected official here, be interested in that move? It seems to do everything that you want. It gets rid of the subsidies, at least by the city. It opens up the lakefront. It takes this issue off the table, which seems to come up as someone who's put these things together and had the press conferences, would you be interested in that?
I'd be interested in seeing what's being presented, but nothing to Cleveland City Council has been presented at all yet.
A no,
So,
the city and go 20 minutes.
this really gives me the opportunity to bring something up that I've been trying to work into our conversation. There's a growing body of evidence, scholarly evidence, about the negative externalities that professional sports generate in local economies. There's evidence that that professional sports causes increase in local crime. It's because there's lots of people concentrated in one place. It's a very attractive environment for pickpockets. A lot of people are drinking. There's a lot of assault and battery that increases, right? It causes increases in traffic. Professional sporting events cause deterioration of air quality because of the traffic, more cars sitting around, more cars on the road. Traffic crashes go up because of, are caused by the games that are held in professional sports facilities. You move that to the suburbs, you move all those negative externalities somewhere else. You make a case certainly that for Cuyahoga County, that could be a good thing along those dimensions, because those negative externalities are all consequences of the concentrated people and economic activity that take place on game day. So there's that.
Hi, I'm Holston, I'm a little West Side resident. I like ball games. I like going to Guardians games. I go to a handful of Cavs games, not so much the Browns, so I can't speak for that, but I feel like when I go to those games, to go sit in one of those seats, have a good time. It's not falling apart. I can get out of the rain if it's there. Bathrooms are fine. It's an enjoyable experience, but I don't need a palace. And I'm kind of wondering who's calling the tune about how nice the stadium has to be. It's good enough for me. And I think that Kansas Red is good enough for a lot of people who go there. So I'd like to hear from you guys about who's calling the tune on that. Why do the owners of any of these teams, here or elsewhere, want it to be a palace for somebody?
There's a saying, those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Let's look at Nashville, Tennessee, and that debate. They have, right now, a football stadium the same age as Cleveland's. The mayor of Nashville and his allies led a year-long publicity campaign in support of a new domed stadium by trashing the existing stadium and claiming that they had studies that would show that it will cost more to keep up the present stadium than to build new. Now, several of the council members attacked that very aggressively, and they said the same things you're saying. Now, look at what you're reading in our media about stadium was constructed too hastily. It was thrown together. It is, this or that, it's crumbling. It's this, it's that. Nonsense. Again, Councilman, you're, I think, aware of the Osborne study that was done last year and indicated that the stadium is in relatively good repair. Over the next 10 years, it's going to require $117 million in capital repairs. Those are all consistent with your points, sir. It is a good facility. I was a 24-year season ticket holder there. I went to every game. There's nothing wrong with that facility, but if you watch what the owner of the football team in Nashville did to convince that community to pay $1.26 billion in public funds for a new stadium, it was all about this campaign and trying to trash the existing stadium and convince the public that it was in horrible shape and you needed to build new.
To replace a stadium that was opened in 1996, right? It's not like the Nashville Stadium was old, really. It was quite new. It's the owners. I mean, the owners are definitely, because they're the ones who are going to primarily benefit from new facilities, because new facilities are going to have larger concourses. They're going to have more opportunities for sales inside the facility. It's going to generate substantially more revenues. That's why we see franchise prices go up when new stadiums are built. So I think the stadium stock in Cleveland right now is relatively new, and I'm sure, like you said, the fans are satisfied with the experience there. Now, one might make a case when Municipal Stadium was replaced that was not such a fan-friendly environment, and that so that benefits the fans, right? And there was some benefit from that, but it's hard to justify huge subsidies, $1 billion, $2 billion, whatever we're talking about, just based on enhancing the fans' experience. And they should pay for it if that's what they want, and they should be willing to pay higher ticket prices in order to finance that. So yeah, I agree with you completely, but it's always the team owners. It's also a pretty small club. There's only 30 NFL owners, right? And they're all going around to each other's stadiums when their team plays on the road and seeing what those facilities look like. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if there's not some degree of competition about, look what I got here. Jerry Jones, look what he's got, right? And every other owner would like to have those shiny new toys that the newest stadiums have.
And as far as the fan, I think this mic is going dead, but the fan experience, there's still an 8,000 person wait list to get season tickets. And remember, the team went 1-31 over a 2-year period and still sold out every single game, going 1-31. So it's not like people are saying, I'm not going to that stadium because of the condition of that stadium.
I just encourage the council members present to call their bluff when you get that deal. They're not going anywhere. Don't put up with what they put in front of you. Call their bluff. See if the mayor makes that deal.
So quick question, I'm an interested raider, I'm a West Side resident, Lakewood City Councilman, a Democratic nominee for state rep on the West Side. I have 2 future state reps here with me. We know that there's going to be a pretty significant ask from the state, as was mentioned earlier. Could you speak to other proposals in your own country that have gone for state dollars?
$5 billion ask.
It's very, very common. It happens all the time. So, I live in Morgantown, West Virginia. It's close to Pittsburgh. And in 2000, when they built the new stadium for the Steelers and for the Pirates, there were 2 referenda that for those projects that both failed and were voted down, and the team owners simply went to Harrisburg, the state capital, and got the money there. When I was living in Edmonton, and they built a new arena for the Oilers, they went to the provincial government and got money. So these deals, and I'm pretty sure that this Nashville deal that Ken's been talking about was substantially state financed.
It was.
And again, the economics of having somebody who pays taxes in Cincinnati have their money go to build a new stadium in Cleveland, the economics of that are pretty hard to justify, right? Because what Vic has already talked about, the benefit principle taxation, which is the people who get the benefit from whatever the provided good or service is should be the ones that pay. So yeah, but it's very common, and it'll happen here. I guarantee 100%.
I would also point out that that means that any subsidy that's granted to the Browns is way bigger than the actual amount of the subsidy, because as soon as the Browns get imaginary $600 million from the state, well, then don't the Guardians get that, and don't the Cavs get that, and doesn't the Crew get that, and don't the Reds get that, and don't the Bengals get that, and doesn't FC Cincinnati get that? And so all of a sudden your $600 billion subsidy becomes a $5 billion, or your $600 million subsidy becomes a $5 billion subsidy, because now every facility is entitled to this. So I would be extremely reluctant to suggest that the state provide any money, especially for a move from, there's literally no economic impact moving a team 15 miles, 10 miles down the road from one place to another for the state of Ohio. That doesn't make any sense at all. Now, if you're attracting a franchise from Dallas to Columbus, we could talk about whether there's economic impact. There's probably not, but at least it's plausible. Moving a franchise, moving a business 10 miles down the road, there's no way that can be any money. Yeah, but that's again the substitution effect. Are we suggesting that people are going to eat more? Right? Are you going to eat out more because there's a new entertainment district? Right? Where are the people at that Arby's? Where are they coming from? They're coming from other restaurants in the greater Cleveland area, and we only say that because That's what the data we've looked at for 25 years suggests.
There you go, ma'am.
I mean, there's more than just retail that they're suggesting that there as well.
But you're still just spatially, you're still just moving things around. I mean, that's the underlying fundamental of economics here. Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's not like anybody, it's not like if you build a new stadium outside Cleveland, that people out there are drawing down their life savings to spend money in and around that stadium. They're just spending people are gonna spend their money over there and not here. And it's hard to justify an economic development policy that says, well, we're gonna benefit this particular area at the expense of all these other parts of the Cleveland metropolitan area or all these other parts of Ohio.
Right, and that's of course exactly what we found in Atlanta. So the Battery, successful in some ways because you can see people going to that entertainment district and eating and going to events there. It's definitely happening. But the total amount of restaurant spending in Cobb County hasn't changed at all. So what that means is that those diners in that facility are coming from other places in the county. No net effect, just redirecting where people are eating. And that's what we suspect, again, based on 25 years of our work, would happen with a dome stadium in Brook Park. Go ahead.
Councilman Kazy, I'm sure you well remember the pushback and the grassroots activism that opposed public funding for the Cavs arena just a few years ago, where we almost got it on the ballot in Cleveland. So that was aborted. What are the chances of it going to a vote for Clevelanders this time around?
Grassroots it, put it on the ballot. I mean,
Will you support it?
you know, I'd have to see the language. Got out of it, didn't I? You ain't putting me on the spot. You almost got me. I have to see the language first. All right, we have about 8 more minutes. I have, okay, 3 more questions. Okay, start with 1, 2, and then 3.
I'm curious, based on how you've seen Cleveland behave in the past and then what you studied from other cities, if you had to guess what is going to happen here and how the deal's going to go down, what would you guess is going to happen?
You had me, huh?
And then I'm wondering if you had a piece of advice for the mayor's administration to get Cleveland the best deal possible, what advice would you give?
Good question.
Those are great questions. The subsidies are going to be provided because they're almost always provided. I've given this talk, I've testified before Congress about this. I've given this talk many places, and my summary is always, nobody ever listens to me. So my prediction is that they'll get because the team owners hold the trump card. They can threaten to move. And so my advice to the mayor would be that not every threat to move should be taken as credible. And I think Ken's already pointed this out. And sure, I'm certain in these negotiations, which are never public, that who knows what's being said, but there is always some sort of threat to move. And I would just tell the mayor in his negotiation that you've got to assess whether it's credible or not, and it's not likely going to be very credible.
Yeah, Cleveland's going to cave, but if they cave for $100 million, I'm not going to get too upset about that, and neither really should anyone here get too upset about that. And if they cave for $200 million, but $100 million of that is general infrastructure that makes the lakefront more accessible in all sorts of ways, that's fine. If they cave for $1.1 billion, I mean, shame on you, right? I mean, I can't win the war, but if I can win some of the battles here and say, look, we know they have a lot of bargaining power, and so, but at least get that bargain more on your end. You know, don't pay list price for the car and then buy the undercoating as well, right? Drive a decent deal, and understand you don't have great bargaining power, but you have a lot. because you are the customers, right? So I think that's a reasonable.
Ken might have something to say about that.
Hi, I'm Randy Cunningham. Sometimes I think the problem is the way that we name or call these various deals. There's economic development, and there's what I call extortion. Or better still, the Luca Brasi School of Economic Development. You got a gun to the city's head, and you've got to go and sign either the agreement or you get your economic brains scattered all over the table. And I've been seeing it since about 1980. You either give the developers, even no matter who it is, you give the developers what they want, or your city is going to be turned into something out of a Mad Max movie, where everybody's fighting wild packs of dogs for food, okay? And I think that we got to go and be really blunt about it and ask what's economic development and what's extortion? What's economic development and what is Luke DeBrasi?
And just as economists, we will tell you, the data suggests very clearly, if you lose the team to Brick Park, you have lost very little economic value to the city of Cleveland or the county of Cuyahoga, right? So it is not your economic brains being splattered all over the place. As a matter of fact, you might actually dodge the bullet by not being on the hook for tens of millions of dollars in annual bond payments. And even if you lose the team to a completely different place, that's wildly painful emotionally, but none of that emotional pain shows up on the ledgers either.
Yeah, it is not, I think that thinking about this as somehow economic homicide is not quite consistent with the facts of what's happened in cities when teams left. Professor Matheson edited a volume recently in honor of one of his longtime colleagues who retired. And in a chapter in that book, I took a close look at what happened in St. Louis after the Rams left, in terms of businesses, and in particular in terms of businesses in the entertainment industry, like bars and restaurants, and over the entire St. Louis metro area. And so, you know what happened after the Rams left St. Louis? Nothing. There were no fewer jobs in bars, in restaurants, in all sorts of entertainment industries. Why? Because the people were spending money other places on entertainment and not in the stadium or around the stadium on game day.
Good afternoon. My name is Leah Jackson. I'm a student at Afro-Brown, and I'm also here as an intern with Black Girl Media. And I know that you have said that professional sports do not bring revenue, they just move it around. Could you ever see an event where a stadium did create or promote economic activity? And with this, I also propose and also wonder, wouldn't this economic activity come from reinvestment into Cleveland, our city here, whether that be education, downtown Cleveland, roads, and such?
So yes, the answer is that we do see certainly certain events. Mega events do bring in folks from outside. So, for example, you build the stadium. You will get, if you build the Dome Stadium, you will get a Super Bowl. Super Bowl brings people from outside the community in, spending money in Cleveland in a way that they would not have otherwise been in Cleveland in February, right? Okay, so that is true. But even with the case of these things coming in, they're still significantly smaller than you might think. So even a Super Bowl, you might think that's hundreds of millions. Move the decimal place one place. It's in the tens of millions of benefit for the city, not in the hundreds. So yeah, these things definitely can bring in people. We actually know that that Major League Baseball teams bring in maybe 800 room nights per game, per home game, which over the course of a season, that's like 60,000 rooms. It's not enough to pay for hundreds of millions of dollars in stadiums, but it is actually some people here, again, coming from outside the community and in, and we do see some of that for sure.
I would just add to that, though, one cautionary note. we like to think that if you can identify somebody who came to Cleveland to go to a baseball game, who would not have otherwise come to Cleveland, and the spending from that person as tangible new economic impact, right? But the problem with that is Cleveland is already a major tourist destination for other reasons. And so what if that person rented a hotel room and went out to dinner and spent money that would have been spent by somebody coming to Cleveland to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Is that really new economic impact for the local economy, or is it just spending from one visitor that is taking the place of spending by another visitor? So, certainly to the extent that you get people from outside, real outside tourists coming in, renting hotel rooms, buying drinks, having meals. If they would not have otherwise come to Cleveland, there is a case that is new economic impact, and that happens. I came to Cleveland so I could go to a game at Municipal Stadium before it was closed down. So, those people were there. They're just not nearly as big as one might imagine. And part of the reason that impact is not as big is because there are many other tourist attractions in Cleveland that are not related to sports that are attracting people.
All right, Ken Silliman, Victor Matheson, Brad Humphreys, thank you very much. I hope this was educational. I hope you got your questions answered. If anybody has any further questions that you would like to ask the panel, they're willing to stick around for a couple of more minutes to make sure that anybody has their questions answered. Thank you very much for coming and attending. We also want to thank Cleveland